Okay, ideologies. I encourage you all to take the ideology survey that's available on the course site in order to help you identify what you think government, that is you and I, that is society, should or should not be engaged in. And there are no right and wrong answers. It's not graded. This is not a test. This is a mechanism by which you self-identify what you think is appropriate for the collective, that is us, because that's what government is, a collective, to do. And you'll quickly realize, as I presume you have from the readings, that there are a lot of different ideas of what government should or should not do. Not just if we look around the world today, but also historically what people think that individuals should be responsible for and what the collective should be responsible for. And there are very few absolute right and wrongs. Now, humanity has come to accept over time there are certain ideas such as ethnically and racially based fascism that are unacceptable for the vast majority of humans. But there are still legitimate disagreements on other things like, should education be a right? Should healthcare be a right? Should everyone have access to roads? Should minimum income be something that you should have access to simply because you're human? Or should all of those be left to individuals to tend for themselves? Those are legitimate disagreements, and as long as we have some sort of grouping of people that coexist, and we've had that for as long back as we can measure human existence, we're going to disagree on how we're going to be governed. People also want choice, and that comes into play with ideology. Americans, more than any other nation, like to emphasize choice, and also more than any other nation tend to reject using that choice. We like to say that we have a choice, and then more than anywhere else in the world, we tend to reject using that. In other words, when it comes to elections, for example, most people, when it comes to local and state elections, simply do not exercise their choice. And in national elections, about half simply choose not to. And there are a lot of other areas of society as well. But all of that comes into play in terms of how we want society to be structured. Maybe it's an acceptable fact that you have the opportunity to express your ideas and your choice, but choose not to do so. That's a perfectly valid argument as well. But ideology, in an organized sense, in a sort of structured sense of where we want society to be, takes this origin of what you think a human is. Do you think we're inherently good? And I'm overly simplifying. Do you think we're overwhelmingly and predominantly good social creatures that seek cooperation to enhance our ability to progress? Or are we inherently selfish, devious, self-centered? Not only does that lead to negative outcomes, but are we inherently more prone to self-interest and survival and our own well-being rather than that of the collective? Those are two generalized ideas of of human nature, going back to Locke and Hobbes. And premise on that, what do you think is the best way to govern society? And there are a whole host of nuances in between, of course. But those general ideas, they are very clearly identified in the two dominant strains of ideology in the U.S., conservatism and liberalism, or conservatism and sort of modern social democracy in the rest of the world. That notion that either you are capable of deciding what's good for yourself, and you don't need a collective lecturing you on what is morally correct and ethically correct, or you believe that humans are deficient in this area and you need moral and ethical guidance. Those are two clearly identifiable strains that are visible in all areas on the political left and the right, not only in the United States but in the world today. One more optimism, one more optimistic about human nature, one more negative about human nature. We tend to emphasize, your readings does a very, very good job of differentiating and between these different strains of ideology, and also teasing out the fact that two things that Americans tend to have difficulties with, and it's not because anyone in this classroom is any less intellectually capable than anyone else in the world. It's just that we have historically in the United States really, really messed up the terminology when it comes to liberalism and socialism and so on. Because we tend to associate liberalism, again, with the political left, with big government, as you see in your readings emphasize, sort of an expansionary collective, more taxes, more government. The rest of the world, liberalism means smaller government, individual responsibility. Yes, sir. In the social area, yes, like libertarians. And that's simply because, and I'll get to this in a second, classical liberalism on the economic area, Adam Smith, for those of you taken Intro to Macro and Microeconomics, very much emphasizes free market forces and individual responsibility. The other that the reading does very, very well is this notion of social democracy that Americans alternatively call communism, socialism, and a whole host of other things that are so far-fetched from reality. I would venture to say that if any of you landed in any of the Scandinavian countries tomorrow and you said that they were social democratic welfare states and you went around, and you would be really perplexed by this whole notion, given that many of those areas that we tend to have restrictions on competition in, they have no limits on competition on. Education, school vouchers for everyone. No forced unionization anywhere, for example, in Sweden. No postal service, period. All privatization, all privatized. No train service, all privatized. Vehicle inspections, all privatized. So the readings does a very good job of sort of differentiating between some concepts and ideas that we tend to have difficulties with in the United States. So what I want to do is elaborate a little bit on the largest of the ideologies to complement the readings that you have. But ideology is really not the facts, as your reading also makes very clear. Ideology is everything to do with what should be, what you think ought to be. And ideology is not a fact-based statement. You can invoke facts to make an argument that your ideology, your idea of what society should be, is better. And that's what you hear on the talk shows, in newspapers, in commentaries. This is why we should have bans on abortion, blah, blah, blah. This is why we should have complete school vouchers for everyone, da, da, da. And you can invoke facts, data to support that. But the principal ideas of what you think society should be is not a fact-based statement. Because people have different ideas of what human nature is, and people have different ideas of how to best use the talent and resources that we have. And throughout society history, in this country, and if you look globally, there are different ideas of what government should or should not do. To take a very clear example that everyone can relate to here. In the United States, there has, for the vast majority of our existence, and still today in polls, been no support for the notion that everyone should have access to health care. We're the only industrialized country in the world where that has never prevailed. Period. But there is an acceptance that everyone should have access to basic education up through high school. Now, in other parts of the world, in developed rich countries like in Europe, the former is an accepted. No matter how poor, how rich, you should have access to the same type of health care, period. Because everything else is secondary. You can't do anything if you're sick, so period. You should have access to it. But when it comes to education, particularly college, there's a very clear distinction between who has a right to go to college and who has not. Who has a right to get an education and who has not. So, those are just two very blatant and clear and simplified examples of two ideas that differentiate between what has been a majority view here and a majority view in many of our competing countries. Yes, sir?
I was going to ask, why do you think that is? Because, I mean, like, without trying to, like, insult people, I mean, like, that's literally, like, you don't understand. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's like, if the clear-cut definition all across the world is something and we don't think of it that way, like, I don't want to say are we stupid and just don't get it? Or, like, why is it how it's presented to us?
No, it's not stupid. If you wish to look into why it is that we don't consider healthcare a right, but rather a privilege, you can look into two arguments. One, the historical evolution of what government should do, and the notion that somehow when you provide something for everyone, it has to be done through government, and that has traditionally been anathema to many, many Americans. But that's actually not reality. I mean, many countries that have universal access to, for example, healthcare, but there are other things like schools, actually don't use government to provide it.
Yeah, like what I meant by how it's presented is like, obviously I think the biggest problem people have in America is it's considered socialist because of how it was intended to be paid for, or still is intended to be paid for. How come in other countries it's not seen that way at all? Like when you talk about universal healthcare, you never would hear anyone say, oh, that's socialist.
Well, for two reasons. The ideas, and it's a good point, we can continue it later. The idea, there are two differences. The idea that government represents the collective rather than some overarching force of negativity, to put it differently, or the idea that government represents you and me rather than this big, cumbersome entity, is vastly different in countries that have a legacy of social democracy, which we don't. Since we've never had in the United States a big socialist party, and we never had a communist threat the way you did in Europe and Canada and everywhere else in the English-speaking world, we had a Red Scare, we had some small number of communists, but we never had a nationally viable party. We never had a nationally viable socialist party. But therefore, when you look out in the rest of the world, the perception was, since it's going to be paid for government, government is socialist, government takes care of the whole, this is something that's going to be overbearing and cumbersome and encroaching upon your civil liberties and your individual rights. Therefore, if you're going to provide something collectively, like healthcare, you're going to limit everyone's freedom. Now, in the rest of the world where you overcame that from socialism to social democracy, government became a representation of what people wanted rather than an imposition. And that's just an historical evolution, and we can debate the nuances and smart people can disagree on sort of nuances there. But the other is also the other example you can look into, and others too. If you want to look into how this debate really has changed, look at Switzerland prior to 1987. They had exactly our system. About 20% were uninsured. The costs were skyrocketing. They were up to 16, 18% of gross domestic product, and the outcomes were pitiful. They were exactly where we were. Exactly. They then decided that it's a heck of a lot cheaper, more efficient, and more effective if you simply say everyone has to be covered, everyone has to pay, and everyone has to choose a private healthcare provider. There's no government healthcare provider, it's just private. Today, their healthcare costs are a third, their health outcomes are about twice as good, and the costs as a percentage of the economy have plummeted. So that's an example of one of those rare things in the social sciences where you have a before and after, which we so rarely get to do because we're dealing with humans. But that's another example where you can look at that. But it really is an idea, neither right nor wrong. It's an idea of what the collective should do. And today, because we have only two overarching big parties in the United States, it is confusing. You will find, quote unquote, modern and conservative and left-leaning Republicans. You'll find moderate and traditional and a whole host of other Democrats. It is confusing. I'm not saying that it's not. Yes, sir.
Do you think the two-party system works in America?
I would never make a judgment as to whether the two-party system in the United States works or not. It's the system we have. And the only way the system can change is if enough people decide to actually support a third-party both at the state and national levels. We've had that twice. In the early 20th century, we got about 16%. Teddy Roosevelt, and then Ross Perot in '92 got about, I want to say 12%. Don't hold me. I want to say around there. But because votes actually don't count, it's the Electoral College. So we'll get to, and many of you perhaps have heard in high school. It doesn't matter if you. The actual number of votes matter very little. It depends on where you get the votes and where you accumulate Electoral College votes, not the actual popular vote. We've had many presidents that have lost the popular vote and won the presidency. So that makes it very, very difficult to acquire a strong third party, because you have to win states to get the Electoral College votes. You have to. It's not enough to have a fifth of the population support you across the country. You're going to get nowhere, unfortunately, with the system. So whether it's good or not is besides the point. This is what we have, and the only way that can change is whether enough people get behind a third party. Now, there are, as I said, it's confusing here too, because within the Democratic Party, we still have something called Blue Dog Democrats. Anyone heard of that before? Yes, sir.
I assume they're like rhinos.
Okay, and rhinos are. Very, very good counterpoint.
Like people who are Democrats, but in name only. Like rhinos are Republicans in name only.
Okay, yes. Within the party, within the Republican Party, there are those who say, well, if you believe in, say, that there's a certain level of taxation that's acceptable, that there's a welfare state that's acceptable, you're a Republican in name only, by certain elements of the Republican Party. And in the Democratic Party, if you are fiscally conservative, if, in other words, you want to really streamline the welfare state, you want to cut back on certain entitlements, you want to balance the budget and cut down the debt over other programs, you are often called the Blue Dog Democrat. Does anyone know where that comes from? Do you know where?
I would not.
Up till the early 1930s, it said we had one government program for military veterans in the United States. But with the Depression, soup lines, unemployment, disaster hit, and more federal programs came about. And the New Deal presented by Roosevelt was very much opposed, particularly by Southern Democrats. Remember, the Democratic Party supported segregation in the South. The Democratic Party supported racial segregation. It was the Republicans who opposed it. And so the Southern Democrats did not want to relinquish the current status. They did not want to expand government policies. They did not want to expand government assistance. And the Northern Democrats actually wanted to. And so Roosevelt figuratively threatened the Southern Democrats, but with saying, if you don't support this expansion that we need for the sake of the country, I will appoint a Supreme Court nominee every year until you do, I forget the increment. But I'll stack the Supreme Court, because there is no constitutional limit on how many Supreme Court justices we can have. We've had 3, we've had 5, we've had 9, we settled on 9. I'll just keep nominating people to support me, and then it'll uphold in court challenges. And they relented, but that combined with the subsequent expansion of Lyndon Johnson's program in the 60s, basically for a long period of time wiped out the Democratic support in the South. Today, of course, again, we flipped in the United States. So most Southern Democrats became Republicans, and today you'd be hard-pressed to find very many liberal Democrats in the South. We've managed to confuse our left and right in the United States many times over the course of our history. That's one outcome of what the gentleman raised, the fact that we only have 2 big parties. Because within these 2 big parties, we actually have 6 parties. We actually do have a social democratic flank. We do actually have a libertarian in the conservative and the Democratic Party. We do actually have sort of modern Christian Democrats in the conservatives. But we have to somehow make them fit within one umbrella. But both parties, nonetheless, stem from this classical liberalism. And again, for those taking econ classes, whether micro or macro, this should be very much common knowledge, combined with the philosophical writings of Locke. The notion that humans are inherently good. We're capable, rational individuals that can actually decide on what's good for us, that can actually decide on what we should or should not do. And when in a collective we decide on how we want to be governed, not only can we reach the best outcome by collectively working together, but we can also change the system of government, modify it, evolve over time. But because we are inherently equal by nature, because we have natural freedom and natural reasoning, it also means that when it comes to the economy, things like buying and selling stuff and anything that isn't absolutely necessary for us to do individually, people should be able to do on their own. Government should only do that which we individually are incapable of doing. So, for example, take something today that you could easily see the private sector doing, but back then nobody thought in their right mind people would either pay for or use in the private sector, namely post office or education. Who in the world would pay for education? Who in the world would want to run a private post office? Remember, this is back when, horse and buggy, mail delivery by foot, this doesn't work. So, in that thinking, this were things that only the collective could ensure. But place it in today's argument, and classical liberals would say, of course they could do that. But the basic premise here is the free market works because if there's some demand for something, someone will produce it. If there's something that you can sell that someone wants, you'll produce it and they'll buy it. And that is premised on the notion that we can rationally not only create the kind of governing structure we want, but we can rationally produce things that others want. We can express ideas. We can work together. We can develop ideas. And we can decide on what's acceptable in society. It also emphasizes that which both parties still has at their core in the United States, and stemming from the economic liberalism, that individuals are far more important than the state. In other words, you and I have more rights than this entity that we've created, this state apparatus, this bureaucracy that we've created. So ensuring that people develop, that individuals can pursue their talents, individuals can pursue their goals and exercise their freedom is far more important than ensuring some idea of a perfect state. But that also means that since you put most of the emphasis on individuals, hard work, competition, enterprise are encouraged. Now, you will perhaps recognize this from discussions on, say, things like the American Dream, on American history, developing expansion of the West. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps, that type of argument that we'll return to. This is very much from the classical liberal sense. And this is still the origin, the economic origin of both parties, and the philosophical, social origins of the Conservative Party today. The problem, though, is, what if you're not able to make use of this? What if you are, by no means of your own, unable to participate, to pursue your talents, either because of physical or mental problems, or because you just happen to be born in the wrong place at the wrong time? In other words, you may be a genius whose parents can't afford to feed you or send you to school. So what happens when you can't participate and take individual responsibility, even though it's not your fault at all? And this is also where some of the arguments about health care to relate to a current issue comes in. Well, then the argument is by modern liberals that there is a role for the state, that is, you and me collectively, to not stifle competition, not take away individual responsibilities, but to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to participate. This is not the ultimate Marxist outcome of equal output. This is equal opportunity emphasized. In other words, we have to make sure that you have the opportunity and the means by which to pursue your talent, your interests, your goals, and productively participate. The problem, though, is when you start deciding on how to help people who, for whatever reason, can't make it on their own, or by the use of by help of their family, you have to have some way of distinguishing them, identifying them. And as soon as you start doing that, you by default start emphasizing characteristics of individuals and thus emphasizing group characteristics rather than individual rights. Because otherwise you wouldn't be able, you have to call people who need this help or that assistance something. And when you start labeling people according to characteristics, you start emphasizing group characteristics over individual rights. And then those group characteristics then become basis for entitlements relative to others. This also then means that you place less trust in individuals and more trust in the collective, you and I, through government, to identify those characteristics and to provide those services. And here is where some of the controversy then emerges with this sort of modern liberal thinking. That while you're telling people that you're still have inalienable rights, you're still born with natural rights and freedoms and individual choice, you are grouping people based upon characteristics because there's a role for government to help them. And when you start grouping people based upon characteristics, then you start emphasizing group rights over individuals. And you're actually not, in the word that we tend to use, discriminating racially, but you are discriminating in favor of some groups based upon characteristics rather than others. And while this is a perfectly legitimate idea to have, and obviously many, both in the United States and around the world have this, in the rest of the world it's called social democracy, here it's called modern liberals, controversy emerges then over what groups, how to characterize, what characteristics, what assistance should be provided, how should we pay for it, how long, and all of those other things that come with saying government should provide something. It's not a new debate. It's not unique to the United States. It's all across the globe. But those problems then arise. Now, we obviously have in the United States neither a pure classical liberal model nor a pure modern liberal model, nor does anyone else. There has never been, nor will there ever be, a pure capitalist model where everything you want to sell and do, as long as you find a buyer or someone else agrees with you, you can do. That has never been the case, and it never will be, simply because there are different ideas over what are the parameters, what is it that this invisible hand that Adam Smith was talking about should limit, and what is it that they should stay off of. So for that reason, again, ideas of what should or should not be done. There's never be a pure marketplace. There'll never be a pure socialist place. So why has the role and the reach of the state grown? For that exact reason. People wanted help. People asked for assistance during crises, and prevailing ideas over rectifying problems in society through government assistance has prevailed. It's only a matter of different extent in the United States versus other countries. But the basic idea is that there are certain things that we should collectively provide for, that we should collectively pay for, that government should provide, has prevailed in any developed country and in most of the developing countries as well. But there, of course, is a counterpoint to this. And going back to classical liberalism, the economic area is not disputed. But Edmund Burke, that had a profound impact on our founding fathers, British parliamentarian, who was very much a Hobbesian in his view of human nature, argued that humans are not, and here he was of course referring to the commoner, the common person, not the educated elite, which made up about 2 or 3% of the British and the global population at that time in the late 18th century. He was instead referring to the notion that the commoner is simply not capable of deciding what's in their best interest. Humans are not inherently capable of deciding what's right and wrong and deciding on rationality and acting always in their best interest. This is very much a negative perspective on human nature, very much in line with Hobbes' view of human nature. And because you are not inherently capable of deciding on what government or what you or your group or your family should do on your own, in other words, you need moral guidance, you need ethical standards. And where should that come from? It should come from government. Now, of course, Burke based his ideas, of course, on Judeo-Christian values without saying so, and in some, conversations and speeches, he of course mentioned that as well. But the point here was that there should be a role for government in actually legislating moral actions so as to guide individuals. And this is where still today we see the roots of the conservative Republicans in the United States and France and Canada and Germany and elsewhere as well, on things like certain individual choices, whether it be drugs or abortion or marriage, this notion that there are moral standards that should be in place collectively, promulgated and legislated in most instances by the collective for the betterment of human society. We are simply not capable of deciding that on our own because society will fall apart. There will be chaos, not necessarily in the war-like sense, but there will be just people doing whatever they want, and it will be completely unorderly and chaotic. So there are moral imperatives that government should insist upon for the betterment of society. Again, not a right or wrong issue, but ideas based upon human nature. However, at the same time, if you have those, then there's still much less need for government to provide financial assistance. Because if you act appropriately, you're raised appropriately, and societal norms are appropriate, then there will be more opportunities. There will be better opportunities for you, and more people will have the ability to pursue their talents and their goals in a competitive society. Yes, sir?
Did you value education, or did you value morals when it came to viewing who was smart, or I guess not smart, who he viewed was able to make their own decisions? Like you said, the 2 or 3%. Did he view them as the educated, or is the moral aspect that made them?
Government had a role in educating people about morals. And correct me here, you're asking about whether, if I understand correctly, whether he emphasized education or just morality. Am I correct?
Yeah, because wouldn't education make a little more sense to try to get people up to that level of self-awareness?
Yes. No, education. You also got to remember, in Britain, what is today public is called private schools because the Crown started paying for the elite, for the education of the elite, and not for the public. But private citizens started educating the public because they thought that was the best way of ensuring that people could best fend for themselves. So from the elite's perspective, there was no reason to mass educate. That came later. So I'm not going to, that's just a confusing terminology, but in that time period, it was better just to educate the elite. It was very much like Plato's view that, you're born into a certain group, therefore you should stay in that group, right? So while government then legislated on moral behavior, that became the education for the populace that they followed. And a manual labor didn't need to know math and science because you were still just building roads and working in factories. That came later about the education. But when public education became widely accepted, and when it became necessary during the Industrial Revolution and more people needed more education, the notions that in the educational curriculum, morals and ethics and proper behavior should be part of it was an absolutely presumed part, of that. So from a traditional conservative standpoint, yes, there should be morality teaching in school. And there was for a long time in say, British schools as well. That there should be certain moral imperatives that everyone, or there are moral imperatives in the view that everyone needs to adhere to. And if you do, you have a much better functioning society, and thus you need much fewer public assistance programs. Because, again, they reject the modern liberalist view, saying, if you provide all this assistance, you're taking away incentives, you're taking away the willingness to work hard, you're de-incentivizing people rather than helping them. Now, again, this is not a right or wrong issue. This is a perspective on how it works. That is why, for example, when you hear the notion that we often hear today, and we'll get back to, welfare dependency, not just in the United States, but everywhere in the developed world, where you get into a cycle where you become dependent upon social assistance, a vicious cycle where you don't get out of it. And that's an argument from modern conservatives showing that, or excuse me, traditional conservatives, and some modern as well, showing that this is how people get stuck in dependency on public assistance. And it's not good for the individual, and it's not good for society. Yes, sir, you had a question, sorry.
Something while we're on Burke, I thought this was one of the most informative readings that helped me really understand the difference between left, right, and middle. And I think Burke had like the most reasoning back then, because there was either left, right, center, or center, left, and center, right. And basically the left and right said my way's right and my way's right, and the center believed that we should have some change and take from both ideas.
Yep, the birth of the left and right in the late 18th century, based on Burke's writings and arguments and the French Revolution, are still with us today. The question is whether, and you'll make up your own mind about this as we go along, whether the center, as you mentioned, and the readings mentioned, is the way it was before, or whether that's changed. It's also depending upon what people consider the center, because what some people consider obvious and natural on the right or the left, others consider extreme. What some people consider a natural progression of humanity, others consider blasphemy. So it's the problem of arguing ideas is that it's only over time when you can see which one prevails. Because many people will never be convinced of an argument in the short term. And that is why you see bickering between individual policymakers, because they genuinely believe, for whatever reason, that they are right and the others are wrong. But if we look over a broader time period, you'll see that general social norms have changed. What used to be banned is accepted. What used to be accepted is banned. What used to be considered appropriate is not. So over time, the ideas change of what's acceptable. Modern conservatives have rejected some of this notion. Again, if you look over time, this is one evolution. There were more people, for example, have rejected the idea that they're not capable of deciding what to do with their own body, or who to marry, or what religion is to be the basis, or if any, for their moral judgments. So modern conservatives over time have sort of de-emphasized these legislative issues. And that's why today, as the gentleman brought up, you, for example, see in the Conservative Party, or Republican Party, pardon me, in the United States, some who are pro-choice on abortion and have no problems with gay marriage, while a significant part still oppose both of those. That's sort of the legacy of both traditional conservatives and modern conservatives on social issues, putting that in real practical terms. But there's still this emphasis on, or de-emphasis on, government assistance and collective assistance, and more emphasis on competition, individual choice, and individual responsibility. And again, this has gone up and down, not only in the United States, but elsewhere in the world too, in emphases. This is not a right or wrong issue, and I keep emphasizing this because when you're first exposed to this, you tend to believe, oh, that's all wrong, well, that's all right. But if you look at U.S. history, how we've evolved, You look at arguments being made today by peers not only your own age, but in all age categories. And you look at arguments around the world. We still have these different ideas in place. There are still people who genuinely believe in all four of these versions because they believe it would create a better society, more prosperity, less poverty, better educated populace. So it's not a right or wrong, it's a matter of how you convince people and what evidence you use to convince people of that. Now, I said we'd never had a socialist movement. When the Bolsheviks took over in Russia, and the Russian Revolution, and communism spread, initially first, of course, in Russia, but then throughout Europe, and turned into not communism either as Marx had thought about it in Marxism, nor Leninism, but rather totalitarianism. There were genuine Marxists in Europe, and there were genuine Leninists in Europe. And each of the now rich, developed European countries had both communist and socialist parties. Most of them have either been abolished or diminished significantly in influence or been reformed. There is no party in Europe today arguing for a return to Soviet-style Leninism. There's no party arguing for totalitarianism. There are no parties in any parliament in Europe arguing for return to the type of totalitarianism that was in place in the Soviet Union. But what evolved from this, starting in the late or mid to late 19th century, was a mix of liberalism and Marxism, not communism as thought of by Lenin, but Marxism. This notion that while capitalism, and this Marx acknowledged in many of his discussions and other writings that were not mentioned in text, while capitalism does a very good job at increasing productivity, and it increases output, and even increases living standards, that much he acknowledged. He then went on to say, well, that cannot hold because the premise of ever-expanding resources and ever-expanding productivity will ultimately fail. You'll use up human resources, you'll use up natural resources, and it will collapse under its own might. Obviously, that was discredited because we found ways of increasing productivity and new resources and diversifying output. But in Europe, intellectual thinking, particularly by Bernstein, started thinking, well, wait a minute, yes, there are problems with capitalism. There are problems with unlimited competition and the plight of the weak and the fact that when companies do really bad, society suffers, etc. So there's a role for government, but that does not mean that we have to take away people's individual freedoms. It does not mean that we ban private companies. That does not mean that we stand with guards shooting people when they try to leave the country, as was the case in the Soviet Union and its East European states up until the fall of the Berlin Wall. So there was a middle way of social democracy that then created what today we call the welfare state. Starting in Germany, Scandinavian countries, and then Britain. And the welfare state is simply a capitalist country with a generous provision of safety nets where if you are not capable of tending for yourself, but you're willing to work, you're willing to contribute as best you can, you will not end up homeless and not without food on the table. That's a very simplistic notion, but that's where the welfare state is today. Just to give you an example of where this has come today so you can really put your hands on it, one of the countries that we, or two of the countries that we tend to in the United States in the media, I encourage you to look at this, we tend to look at as the most socialist, and you can actually, if you want to see something really funny, look up Jon Stewart's The Daily Show, Stockholm Syndrome from, I think it's 2010. It's available on YouTube. We tend to think of as the most socialist countries, Denmark and Sweden. They actually have fewer labor restrictions than we do. If you want to hire someone today and fire them tomorrow, go right ahead. If they don't want to join, if you want to hire them and say you can't join a union and they don't want to, okay. If you want to work, we'll make sure that you get your rent and food and insurance and everything covered. But if you say you don't have no interest in working, then you're on your own. Thank you very much. Goodbye. So there is an incentive to work, incentive to contribute, an incentive to support society, and you will not end up homeless or hungry. On the other hand, you actually have to contribute or wish to contribute to the best of your ability. That's the evolution of the welfare state. But when it started, it was really an attempt to mix a government, a collective that provided for those who couldn't help themselves, and to provide certain services to prevent capitalism from harming the rest of society, while keeping free enterprise and individual choice wherever possible. That's really how this welfare state started. Some went further in the government areas. England and Sweden in the 1970s were very, very heavily centralized government run. Germany much less so. Some went fewer, but that's where we are today. We really haven't had this evolution. We really never went through this because, again, we didn't have a communist threat. We didn't have a socialist party. So that's why it's understandable that even in the latest presidential election, not only the conservative candidates, but some of the Democratic candidates talked about socialist Europe. And believe me, if you go and talk to, and some of you may have relatives who travel there, talk to a Swede or a Dutch or an Irish, they laugh. I mean, and I was 2 months in 4 countries in Europe during the latest presidential election. And the headlines, I mean, it's like jokes coming out of the U.S. presidential election when you hear Americans talk about socialist Europe. So I think it's understandable that we've come to see the rest of the world in this way because of the lack of our own experience. But it makes it difficult to have a valid comparison if you hold on to those. Now, are there still Marxists in the world, and why are we reading there? Are there still totalitarians? Absolutely. Absolutely. There are those who think that the government should basically do almost everything. There are countries like Cuba and Venezuela where the government runs 70 to 90% of all activity. There are totalitarian states like Belarus and North Korea where you are not allowed to speak anything that is not approved by the state or you risk death. There are other, though, particularly academics, who try to look at, and sort of new Marxists, who tend to look at the world and say, look, there are elements of exploitation, there are elements of inequality because of exploitation between the rich and the poor, between strong rich countries and weaker poorer countries. And so the legacy of Marxism today is seen sort of as in not on individual levels, but on a global level. Or even within the U.S., not Isaac Sanders, what's it called? Bernie Sanders, pardon me. An independent senator from Vermont in his last term. He's a self-declared socialist who very much ascribes to the notion that there are inherent inequalities, structural inequalities in the United States where the rich take from the poor and the rich benefit only because they have the legislative and the financial means to benefit from the labor of the poor. And he points to the widening income gap, the poverty rates, as evidence of this. So yes, there are still thinkers that believe this genuinely. So it's not a completely obliterated and defunct idea. Yes, sir?
So he thinks that it's Sanders thinks that socialism. He's a socialist, and he would say that that's because he thinks that the inequality structures.
Yes.
If that is true, and the wealthy do have that, then isn't that socialist? Like in the sense of how socialism has played out through when it actually is existent. Like when the extreme, like in Soviet Russia, when this extremely wealthy took all the power and the wealth away from everyone else. Isn't that actually what?
Okay, so you're asking whether the inequality itself isn't social. Well, remember two things. In the Soviet Union or Eastern Germany or Belarus, it's very difficult for us to contemplate this, but corruption was about a third of the annual production. Yeah.
Socialism, but like that's how it played out with corruption.
Yes. So you're arguing that it's socialism because they're using the available collective resources to garner more
and
riches?
Their own
Okay.
power.
I see where you're coming with this. Because they can make better use of the laws and the opportunities, everything from free roads to...
government controlling business, business controlling government.
Yes, okay. You're right. Okay, I see where you're coming. You'd be hard-pressed to find socialists arguing that that's the case. They would agree that because companies have been allowed to become so large that they can't really fail because all of society will suffer, they can also write laws and influence laws that benefit them because they know that if they were to go under, you can think of companies, Bank of America, Walmart, you would have detrimental effect on everyone. And that's a legitimate point from a neo-Marxist or a socialist criticism of the current system. Yes. Whether they would agree that that represents socialism, they would probably take objection to that because they would say this exemplifies free market capitalism gone awry. This exemplifies where competition has been allowed to go to such a point where there's only a few oligarchs that run the country, and therefore they're basically running the show, writing legislation, buying off policymakers. That's what the argument would be. And people can have genuinely well-meaning people can have differences of opinion on how we've gotten here or whether this actually has occurred. Now, when we look at the American dream, when we look at American society after looking at the foundations of American government in a few weeks, you can bring this up again because some of the data I'll show and some of the data that you have pointed to here brings up these questions. We can genuinely well-meaning people can differ and disagree on why we've gotten to the point where we are, but we have to first agree on the facts and then agree on why we've gotten to the point where we've gotten. And the facts of our economic and financial situation in the United States are not very good. In fact, they're not very good at all, regardless of what your ideas of the reasoning and the reasons for it are. There are also fascists, new Nazis, neo-Nazis, and believe this term that's in your readings and that you keep hearing, neoconservatives, neo-fascists, it simply means new, a new modified version of an idea. Ideologies evolve, spin off, modify. So neo simply means new. So a new type of conservatism, neo-fascism, a new type of fascism. We thought perhaps that with the defeat of Italy and Germany in World War II, that fascism was gone. But as I think all of you can start to relate to, particularly if you're studying psychology, you can legislate all you want. We didn't abolish discrimination in the United States by banning discrimination legally. You abolish it through convincing people of the inappropriateness and indefensibility of their actions and, of their ideas. You can force people to do something without changing their minds. Japan surrendered in World War II after we dropped 2 nuclear bombs. It didn't change their minds about capitalism. It didn't happen as the 2 bombs went off. That came over a period of time. Fascism has, for a variety of reasons, remained sometimes dormant, sometimes very active, because there are still people, not only in the United States, but more predominantly, perhaps, in areas such as Eastern Germany, Northern Italy, parts of Asia, where this notion that because of race or nationality, one's ethnic lineage, etc., that somehow you're superior, and that that's an appropriate way to go. In the state of Pennsylvania, we actually have hundreds of racists and fascist groups registered that are publicly known, that you can look up. There's studies done on them as well. I've had Aryan Nation members recruit that I've seen physically here on campus. And one of the students I had first semester asked me what I thought, and I said, just wait a few weeks until you read about this and then respond to whomever is inquiring. It is very similar, again, studies in psychology and sociology shows, it's very similar in appeal to gang membership. Because the argument here is that, going back to nationalism in particular, we are different. You should belong to a group that is superior, ethnically, racially, intellectually, physical, to someone else. They're worse, you're better. You're with us, you're not with them. With us, as a group, you are someone. Without us, you are no one. Now, this has a great deal of appeal to a lot of people in emotional turmoil, mentally unstable, perhaps, gone through problems. But if you think as a group, why would this happen in Germany, for example? Those who know your history may remember, Germany suffered worse during the Depression than the U.S. did. Far worse. And when they were unable to elect a government in the early 1930s, 32, 33, Germany's Socialist Nationalist Party, through Hitler, was appointed prime minister, and he built the Autobahn. He built roads. He put people to work. He fed people. This is no defense of Hitler by any stretch of the imagination, but factually you look at what was happening in Germany from 33 to 36. He rebuilt the country and gave people hope. He completely turned it around because, remember, Germany had been ostracized and blamed for World War I. They were shunned. They paid reparations. They were outcasts. They suffered immensely. Here was someone who wanted to reinvent the German folk, wanted to go back to Hegel and the pride of being German from the 19th century, and really inspired people and gave them hope and jobs. Of course, very intellectually savvy, because once you get people food, jobs, and shelter, after having none of that, they are much more willing to blindly follow you and adhere to anything you say. Yes, sir?
That's exactly what I was saying. Someone just gave you a job, car, food, and your family's surviving now, and maybe he says something that you don't quite agree with, but hey, he did all that for you, like, maybe I'll go along with it. It worked, you know?
Yes, when you save people from destitution, they will follow you. And so when this rhetoric and the policies of exterminating the unwanted, not just Jews, but physically disabled or others unwanted, and propagating this notion of the Aryan Nordic model that was superior and everyone else is inferior, and we restore the German Reich and take over the world. And then you got adherents from Germany Japan under Toto and Italy. People followed. And because you were given pride again, Germany was accepted again, being German was good again. And of course, this creates a whole host of problems. Not just because many people today think that this notion that, first of all, men should dominate, women had really no role in this, period. You should be home and have babies, period. Secondly, the fact that one nation is superior to someone else, even in a country like Germany where you had a lot of other ethnic groups involved. Hitler was Austrian himself and had no lineage from the Scandinavian countries that he held up as a sort of national, as he held up as a ethnic model. But also the fact that economically this is ruinous, absolutely ruinous. You have no input from intellectuals, no input from economists, no input from individuals, a blind adherence to the leader. It works for a while. I mean, any of you, if you were given, $1 million and had no idea what to do, you would generate some economic activity regardless of what you did. But pretty soon that would run out, and it would be pretty much disastrous unless you had some sort of planning. And that's pretty much what fascism ended up doing. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, do you think that the ideologies that exist today in a lot of countries, like foreign policy, or to an extent, I guess, domestic, because that's what controls foreign policy, like thinking that your nation's better than everyone else and that you can, like, almost act upon it?
Well, you're asking about whether this shows up in national policies and foreign policy. There's a difference between national interest, which has sort of an element to that, but if in the idea of the national interest today is not the idea. When the United States talks about its national interest, or Germany talks about its national interest, or Britain talks about its national interest, it's not the nation as a racially or ethnically pure. It's a short for the nation state's interest. In other words, what's best for our economy, what's best for the population. Now,
Spin.
well, there's not the ethnic and racial and paternalistic elements that you would find in pure fascism. We're not talking about U.S. interests with a presence in the Middle East because of white Southern Republicans or Democrats, right? We're not. It's in that instance the national interest in the Middle East is defended because is justified based upon our solidarity and alliance with Israel and our still need for certain oil imports. So, but none of those are tied to the type of ethnic and racial and sexist basis of this type of ideology, of fascism. Is it a type of nationalism when it goes so far as to saying we want all the benefits from imports in our presence, but none of the problems with, exports, but none of the problems with imports? Yes, and we'll bring that up later. Yes, there is an element of that called sort of mercantilism, and it's mentioned a little bit in your reading as well. But are these prevalent? In some areas more than others. Are they in power anywhere? No. Do they exist? Absolutely. The problem and the joys of democracy is you do not dictate what people believe. There are people who believe that 9/11 was staged by the U.S. government and it all was a big conspiracy. There are people who believe that we never walked on the moon. You can't dictate what people believe. So people are going to adhere to beliefs that many others think are indefensible. Another idea that have become much more mainstream today, of course, is what evolved as a separate ideology, since in the United States, like in most other countries, women were considered secondary citizens for the longest time. Remember when we spoke about all men being created equal at the founding of this country, we still had slavery, Native Americans were not even thought of as humans, women had no rights. So for Jefferson, those were aspirations, goals to ultimately be met, but he knew that they could not be implemented at the time of the writing of the Constitution, because then there would have been no agreement. But in the mid-19th century, before, but particularly after the Civil War, this notion, started by Susan B. Anthony in upstate New York, and then spreading throughout the country. This is really where feminism globally started, because the Quakers at that time and still considered women to be equal. They educated women on the same level as men. And Susan B. Anthony really couldn't understand why the rest of the society shunned female education, rejected women involvement. In the medical journals in the late 19th century wrote about women's heads being too small for intellect and just big enough for sex. And this is the New England Journal of Medicine at that time. So this notion of inferiority was permeating all of society to a very large extent. But there were leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Wollstonecraft who began this campaign for not only women, female right to vote, but also right to education and other involvement. They joined up with the anti-slavery movement, and then after the Declaration of Emancipation and the acceptance that had largely been won over, at least legally, there were many who considered Susan B. Anthony to be sort of an outcast. Well, it's enough already. You abolish slavery, you recognize the women, but there was no voting rights, there was no expectation they should get an education. But she persisted. She traveled the country, traveled throughout Europe. She became more known there in the U.S. today than choose your best-known celebrity. Okay? Put Britney Spears and Justin Bieber together, and she was still more well-known in the country at that time. Newspaper reporters tended to follow her around in the 1870s and 80s to follow what was going on across the country because she was traveling so prolifically. Now, she died before women got the right to vote, but she did make a deal with Wilson before World War I that she would garner support. The National Organization for Women would garner support on the home front for the war effort in exchange for a promise to introduce women's right to vote after World War I, which eventually happened. But that then started other legislative fights, such as equality in the workplace, the right to education. I mean, for a long time, women were very underrepresented in educational institutions, let alone the workplace. And then also equality of pay, of course. There is no, perfect equality, but in college today, in law schools today, there are more women than men. Graduation rates are much higher for women than men. Men's graduation rates are falling. Women's graduation rates are rising. The largest increase in wages during the recession, or the only increases, came for women, not for men. Simply because one contribution being that, or one reason being that there are more women in service sector jobs. But if you look at the law school, as I said, business schools and colleges, just by sheer demographics, there will be much more women in higher education and higher corporate settings in 5 to 10 years, simply because there's a vast majority of women in all of those institutions today getting education. But when it comes to legislative bodies, we still have a long way to go. It's improved dramatically, but there's still a long way to go. I mentioned before, and one of the reasons why women themselves, in surveys a few years ago, say that more women are not running for national office in the United States, is that there are no guarantees for child support. There are no guarantees for maternity leave. There's no financial assistance to have kids, and it really is an impediment if you want to run for national office. In all of these other countries where you see much higher percentages, there are child care centers, etc. Things that some of us may not think about all the time, but it really makes a difference when it comes to female participation in the legislative bodies. Have we made inroads? Yes. Some of the most important countries in the world, Germany, England, Iceland, Australia, have been run by women. Some of the most important institutions today, the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States, the International Monetary Fund, are run by women. So have there been progress? Absolutely. Is there a long way to go still? Yes. But remember, regardless of what your ideas are, regardless of what you think government or society should do, regardless of which of these ideologies you tend to agree with, or if you are like most people, split. Some things you find attractive in one, some things you find attractive in another. Don't ever just accept what others say as a fact whenever you can substitute the word should or ought. You can support your arguments, and logical argumentation is a big part of getting a college education. To logically support whether you're writing a fact-based paper or whether you're writing an argumentative paper. To logically argue your case. But if you can insert ought or should, question it, be critical, assess it. There are far too many people who listen blindly to whatever talk show or radio show or newspaper, whatever they listen to, that reinforce their existing views and never bother to actually expand upon their ideas, and expand upon what others are saying. So take that away. This is not a right or wrong, but be questioning, be critical. This is not an endorsement to go out and endorse conspiracy theories, but be critical about what you hear and what is said to be factual. Okay? Thank you.